Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Humboldt-University for having me, and Professor Christoph and Robin for inviting me to this event. It's such an honor and a pleasure. So, for people who are not familiar with BitLand, BitLand Global is a blockchain-based land title registry. So what we do is we go into regions that are subject to title disputes or have poor land title infrastructure, and we approach governments or populations and present this infrastructure to them as a potential solution to settling disputes. And the project actually originated in Ghana by the CEO, Narigamba Mansubu. So the reason he originated the project is because he actually is subject to the problems of land title registries. And what he realized was that with the promise of blockchain, the problem that he encountered frequently with the land title disputes could be settled. But what he also realized is that if you're in a rural place, you can't have access to blockchain if you don't have internet or electricity. So these were two major issues that were raised early in 2014 when he started the project. So what we have been doing since 2014 is trying to establish an educational approach to blockchain technology concerning how the technology can actually be implemented and the benefits that can actually come from the tech, because people seem to rush to try to understand the underlying technology without actually understanding the potential benefits or the potential downfalls. So this is where BitLand has been about we are an educational initiative first, infrastructure protocol second, and then the blockchain is actually third in our hierarchy of necessities. So just to discuss, we have a few people on our team who are working in the blockchain space. So myself, I've worked with Factum, Scenario, and a few ICOs that have raised millions of dollars. And the issue is, early in the blockchain space, there was very much focus on Bitcoin, and it was, if you were not a Bitcoin evangelist, you got shouted down, and basically your views were attacked. So it's been a very uphill battle for our project, because many people didn't understand why land titles needed blockchains to be associated with them. So BitLand has been working very hard to try to explain to people why blockchain could be attached to different types of assets, whether it's land titles or insurance policies. So as mentioned in the previous talk, the blockchain is a function of creating transparency in transactions. So if you have a person who transacts with another person, the blockchain just basically makes that an immutable record and makes it so that anyone can access that record if they need to. The issue becomes how much information really needs to be accessed by the public on a daily basis. Now, if you're looking for a house and you're trying to find out who owns the house, you need to find out things about that property. That's publicly accessible information. Now, if you need to know potentially who has a tax lien on the house, that may not be, the identity of the person may not be publicly accessible, but it's on a record somewhere. What BitLand is trying to do is establish the blockchain access to the data, but also create access control points, because in many cases, some information is sensitive and does not need to be accessed by every single person. And in some cases, that sensitive data needs to be accessed by a specific government individual that needs access rights to a large amount of sensitive data. So when you have a blockchain that is supposed to be the medium upon which that data is transacted, the access control points become the major issues of security. And if blockchain is meant to be the most secure protocol available publicly, we have to make sure that the access control points are actually set up to keep that security, the integrity of that security intact. And what we see in many cases is with the thefts and robberies that happen surrounding blockchain, it's never the blockchain itself that's being hacked. It's the access control points. It's the website interface. It's the wallet interface or a keystroke logger that's recording the password. There has not technically been a blockchain that's been hacked, but there have been many millions of dollars hacked surrounding blockchains, and this is where the false promise of the security of the blockchain is overshadowed by the lack of knowledge about security by the users. So in many cases, the weakest link in the security chain is the user, and we have to make sure that the user is educated, which is why Bitland is so focused on education. So without educating the population or educating the governments that are going to be implementing this tech, we could be basically setting up everyone for failure. And this is where, in presenting the promises of a blockchain, we also have to be cognizant of the potential downfalls. And again, as I pointed out, often the biggest weakness in the security chain is the user. So when we're talking about why we should apply blockchains to land title registries, if you look at Africa as a continent, for example, I believe 60 to 70% is the current number of unregistered plots of land, whether it's farming land or residential or commercial property. So we're talking about one of the biggest continents on the planet being largely unmapped or unsurveyed, and those lands are not accurately registered within the government. So what this causes is a lot of land title disputes where a property is sold to multiple people. Someone can sell a property to 3 or 4 people, and then the third or fourth person does not realize that they did not actually purchase the property that they were sold. So with the potential application of blockchain, when you have an immutable record of transaction, if one person sells a property to another, you can go check the blockchain and be ensured that that transaction was legitimate and that transaction only happened between those 2 people. Therefore, the third and fourth sale of a property is not going to be possible when a person can go check to see if they are purchasing the property from the rightful owner. So as well, you have many data storehouses in governments that do not have connection or ability to have data cross-reference. And they have done this for security measures to keep the integrity of their data warehouses, but what ends up happening is there becomes redundancies of data in the inability for every warehouse to communicate with each other in real time. There may be one government official or one government warehouse that has a different record than another because they are not able to consolidate the records at a pace that keeps up with real-time transactions in the real world. So what blockchain does is allows real-world transactions to be placed in a digital format, but as well, because those digital records are immutable, it creates a scenario in which fraud or abuse of information disparity is not as possible as it was before. It's not a perfect solution, mainly because there are governments in control of the distribution of this data. So if a government does not approve a land title registry being registered to a blockchain, then they still function based on a paper registry, and even though the technology exists, the people don't benefit, and that government stagnates. So the issue becomes, if a government is corrupt, or if a government does not want to enable their citizens to have these types of transactions accurately, how do we implement the system and convince that government to move towards a more transparent system? This has been one of Bitland's biggest obstacles because obviously Ghana is one of the most corrupt governments on the planet. So when you're talking about trying to implement technology that's going to make them less corrupt, convincing them to implement that is not a very easy task. So what we did was we kind of took the Trojan horse approach concerning You give them a gift with them thinking that it's going to benefit them. So when you approach a government, you tell them, this is going to increase your tax revenue because currently you have a bunch of people who are not paying you taxes because their lands are not registered. And this gets the government's attention because they hear capital, they hear revenue. So the issue becomes presenting the proper argument to the proper audience. Now, if you're going to the population of a country and you're telling them, hey, we're going to have your government take more taxes from you, they're not going to want to hear that. So this is where, when we go to the populations, our pitch for Bitland is completely different, and it's presenting them a tool that is going to empower them to be in control of their property, even in face of a corrupt government that may try to steal their land and sell it to a foreigner without their permission. Because one of the things that ends up happening is, in many cases, if there are poor land protection rights, a government will steal land from a large group of people, then sell it to foreigners, and then the foreigners will not be local, then they'll steal it from the foreigners and go sell it to different foreigners. And this cycle will continue over and over, and no one will ever really know who the proper owner of a land title is. So this is where, when you're trying to fix corruption, you cannot actually call out corruption. And this is, again, it creates a intrinsic hurdle in the sense of, if we're trying to convince the populations that we're trying to fix corruption, but we're also trying to convince the governments that we are trying to bring them more money, it seems like we're a paradoxical organization. But again, this is, we understand that the audience needs to hear a certain thing to get them interested in the technology. So, because land title records are a major issue in many countries, using Ghana as an example is a great start. However, the intricacies of each country demand that each country gets its own proper attention. So in Ghana, there's stool and skin rights, which basically put 80% of the land title ownership in the hands of the chiefs or the chief system, and the other 20% is owned by the government. And this is where, this means that the people have to go to the chiefs for protection, and the chiefs are basically protecting the people from the government. And it creates tensions between the people and the governments, and it creates tensions between the chiefs and the governments. So as a third party, Bitland comes in and does not identify itself with a government, and as a private actor, we can transition between the chiefs and the government as ombudsperson or people, in the sense that when we are presenting the potential applications for the technology, we can present the pros and cons to each side without seeming as if we have special interest in either side. So because we're not part of the chiefs groups, and because we're not part of the government group, each side respects our opinion and listens to us. And this has allowed us to make a lot more progress in the poorer rural areas than the government's been able to, because the government officials aren't actually able to go into these areas. The people do not want to interact with the governments because they are so abused, or they feel so oppressed and abused by these entities that they do not want to interact with them at all. But this creates a scenario which makes it difficult to move forward by implementing new tech, because if the government actually does want to change, those people still don't trust it. So this is where, in Ghana, there has actually been a complete reversal of the government with the last election, and the government is actually a very focused, I want to say populist, but it's really early to tell. But regardless, the government has completely changed its rhetoric, and the people are interested in it, but they're not 100% trusting of that transition yet. So it's periods like these that create scenarios in which we can potentially change how organizations run, but it has to come under a trusting transition. And this is where We are connecting to the people. In every country we operate, we have local representatives to make sure that that person understands the culture locally and that person understands the history locally, because what this does is establishes a connection that allows the locals to accept BitLand as part of their own paradigm rather than us imposing BitLand on them. So you can see we have an Indian flag for the BitLand logo right here. We actually have a logo for each country in Africa that represents their local flag, because what we want to do is establish that every culture has more than likely different land title registries, laws underlying those registries, but even further, they have different cultural nuances that underlie the laws behind that. And we want to make sure that they understand that BitLand is not trying to change those cultural history or how the history impacts their current paradigm, but we want to mesh our approach with the blockchain tech and their current system. So India is a great example because their system is very different from Ghana concerning how the land registries are tracked and as well how they are regulated. So one of the things that we have is we include the latitude, longitude, proof of title ownership, proof of transaction, and the address and the owner. So there are a list of data points that we make sure to include in every registered property, and these are also to ensure that we're not registering properties that aren't owned by the person saying they're registering them. So if someone wants to register a property with us, they have to have a land title that is approved by that local government. Now, if someone is living in an area that the government doesn't have a functioning land registry, they can come register with us to potentially be registered later after we go work with that government. And this becomes, we are trying to create a pathway from not being, or what would be the black market onto the real estate market. So what ends up happening is you have people who are in impoverished regions, and they are treated as charity cases, and they are treated in the sense that we don't know if they're the landowners or if they're just renting or if they're squatting. And the technology needs to be agnostic to that person. The technology needs to only recognize the legal landowner and be able to transact that land. And what we also want to do is not draw any disparity between a low-value property and a high-value property, because what ends up happening is one of the main reasons that low-value properties are not sustained is because they have poor land title protection. Thus, the people who live on them do not upkeep them. So what we are basing our implementation on is that if we help protect the land in the poorer regions, the newly protected land will then have more incentive to have upkeep or build it up to develop. And in the case of Ghana, because there was the chief system, one of the things that we had to do was build in a way that we could get permission from the chiefs, but also get acknowledgement from the government that it's legal, because you have, in this case, two parties who are regulating. And in Germany, the idea of a third party that's not your government regulating your actions would seem absurd, because technically this is a first world country and we're not in the tribal state. So when we're talking about applying the most advanced technologies into tribal states, you can't just overlook the tribal culture, and you have to actually include the tribal culture into the technology, or else they will not adopt it. And this is what we've seen over and over. So the technology is actually very simple concerning, you have a landowner, you have a chief, and then you have a government, and you need to get consensus from those three parties. And once you get consensus, you can put that on the blockchain so that it's transparent to see that this piece of property has a legal owner and has been approved by the chief and the government. And this creates a transaction that would then, from that point on, be immutable, and as well, it would be very difficult for someone to create a fraudulent transaction with something that has that level of data point. Also, one of the things that we have been trying to do is create intuitive tools for these to be used, because if you look at Apple, you look at IBM, one of the disparities between the technology has always been how intuitive is the interface and how much does the user have to know before they can jump in and start using the tool. So what we wanted to do is make the tool so that if you don't know anything about blockchain, you can still jump in and use the technology immediately and have it function exactly the way it needs to function. So in this case, we are building a tool for a land title owner, a chief, and a government official. In the case of India, you have a unique land title registry system, which is the Khasra and the Basra system. So it became a very different system than the Ghanaian system, but what Bitland is doing is advocating that every country has their own registry. One registry will not work for every country. The legal laws in the United States for real estate are going to be slightly different than they are in Germany, than they are in Ghana, than they are in India. And the registries have to reflect these changes or differences. And this is where what we are trying to do is build a tool that can be modified to reflect those slight changes, but has a base level data collection that is established for international standards. Because what also happens is when you have a new industry like blockchain-based real estate, there also needs to be newly established standards, and the better thing to do is to regulate yourself before you overstep bounds and force the governments to come in and regulate. And this is where we've consulted many lawyers, legal teams, government entities to ensure that we're following local and international laws when we're building our protocol, but as well, it is important that we stay ahead of regulations and connect to governments, because if we do something that ends up getting reversed, then that would actually impact the people that we're trying to help. So we're trying to make sure that we don't negatively impact the people that we're trying to help by being flippant about legal ramifications of our actions. So one of the big issues that has come up is how do you transition the blockchain into the real world, especially concerning when you're mapping real world properties, or how do you know that the survey that's coming into your blockchain is actually legitimate? So this is where, from the very beginning, we've been operating as the access control point, not to just hand over the data entry to random users yet, because we're still in an early stage. So we've been in control of entering all the data to ensure that it's accurate. And in this process, we've been working with government officials to make sure that all of the titles that come in are recognized by a local registrar. And this is because in these early stages, there is a potential for fraud. There is a potential for someone from the United States to come in and say they own a property in South Africa or Ghana. So we're wanting to make sure that in the early stages, we are not susceptible to problems that we could avert by simply controlling access. Now, in the decentralized space, access control is a dirty word in many ways because it implies centralization. And in some cases, there do need to be some centralized points of data entry because, again, there are the potential for fraud if there is no real check and balance concerning who's entering the data or where the data is coming from. So this is one of the reasons it's extremely important that we have been working with governments to ensure that the data we're bringing in is in fact accurate. We are looking to work with the Chhattisgarh government in India to start mapping rural areas, and we're going to be pitching to them in early February. But one of the issues is that governments want to see results before they implement anything nationwide or statewide. So this is where the process of implementing land title registries is a very graduated process, because no government is going to implement any new technology without testing it first. But because of the political implications of transparent ledgers, many governments are hesitant to even pilot these projects. And it has become an issue of presenting the potential benefits to the populations, so then the populations go push the governments to implement these technologies. So, as I was pointing out, there are some things that do not, when it comes to decentralization, there are points of diminishing returns concerning protecting the people. And there are a level of potential downfalls that could come with completely decentralizing land title registries. Main thing being the enabling of neocolonialism. Now, this is a major issue when you're talking about post-colonial states. You want to ensure that they have protection on their land titles to enable foreign direct investment, but we now know scientifically that if the locals own their property, they're actually more productive, up to the tune of 16%. So if someone owns their business or if they own their land, they're going to work harder than if someone who doesn't live there or is a foreigner owns that land. And this is something that can be shown with data. So this is where what we're trying to do is take the best mix of decentralization and centralized access control to ensure that the data that we're taking in is accurate, but also we're not trying to create a scenario in which a government official or any large capital holding entity can take a lot of land in one purchase or without having a check and balance in that purchase. This is where the physical hardware infrastructure that is in the real world is more important in many ways than the blockchain itself, because if you have education hubs, if you have data kiosks where people can go enter their information, or a government headquarters where they can go enter, then accessibility is no longer an issue, and also there is a integrity point that keeps people from committing fraud because they're working with the government in that case. It is very idealistic to want to give everyone the potential to register their property from their cell phone, but at this stage, that is not really feasible. And there are a lot of things that are not feasible at this stage with 100% decentralization, which is why taking the pragmatic approach is not often as quick as 100% decentralization. However, the long-term effects are going to be more lasting for the populations. So looking at India as an example, one of the things that is necessary is to have private key infrastructure and public key infrastructure to ensure that people's identities are protected, and that if someone needs to have data examined, that can be done without compromising their identity or compromising any sensitive data that is included in that record. In India, what we are trying to do is leverage smartphone technology with the government to say if there are the Chhattisgarh government is going to distribute 5 million smartphones to the population. So what we're going to try to do is work with that technology to establish a trust network between the people who have access to the blockchain. And from there, we are going to try to expand that network so that those 5 million early adopters are basically our ambassadors of the technology. So we're going to have 5 million effective testers of the tech, and hopefully those people will then turn around and take it to the other 20 million people in the state as a success story. So Bitland is currently operating in 7 countries to varying degrees, and we are focusing on these 7 countries to establish protocols that can then be expanded into other countries. Hopefully, the protocol becomes a force that can be implemented on its own so that we don't have to take it places, and that people can then adopt the technology and adopt the protocol on their own and take it to their own governments. But at this point, we have South Africa, Botswana, Nigeria, Kenya, Mauritius, Ghana, and the United States. And because of the various types of poverty that comes from land title protection, the Bitland protocol is implemented depending upon the situation. So in some cases, we may be focusing on farmers. In some cases, we may be focusing on miners. And in some cases, we may be focusing on just the residential population. We had connected to the Mauritian government and have learned a lot directly from their government because they have actually been digitizing their registry for the last 10 years. And because they have a relatively small population of 1.4 million, it has given us a great example of potential downfalls, but also how to scale the project relative to small and large populations. So we have a prospectus that basically gives an idea of what we spend our money on when we are building a Bitland Center, to show that the most important thing for this technology, again, is there needs to be physical infrastructure to support the blockchain. Otherwise, the blockchain cannot reach these areas. There needs to be people to take the blockchain to the locals, and then there needs to be electricity. And this is where there are basic needs that need to be met before blockchain technology can actually change the planet in the way that has been promised. And this is where Bitland is trying to bring education and infrastructure to help bring the promise of the blockchain. Thank you very much.
Fantastic stuff. Thank you very much, Chris. That was really highly informative. Before I ask around if there's anybody asking any question, let me give this remark. What I find so surprising is you seem to have found a solution. I'm telling always the story, which I find fascinating. California tried to adopt the German land register system in the early 10s or 20s of the last century. And after something like 20 years, they gave up, because it was much too complicated. You seem to have found a better and easier solution that even a corrupt country like Ghana is doing this job. If this is really the case, then secondly, are you already connected with the World Bank and all these development banks around on the globe? Because that is what they actually are looking for.
Yes, we're actually, we've been in talks with the World Bank since 2015, and because they've had so many failures with land registries, like to the tune of $500 million in the past 15 years, they're obviously skeptical and they want to see results first. But we've been, one of the main things that Bitland wanted to do was see how far we could get without money. So then once we got to a certain point, we could say, we did this all without money. Now World Bank, whatever you have, we can do more with that. So yeah, we're waiting to present our case to the World Bank.
Right. Any question? Matthias. Take the micro like a beer bottle.
I will. Thank you for the presentation. It's a great project. I have just a very short technical question. So, at the end of the day, when the land register is rolled out, will this be a public blockchain where every landowner will be a node, or is it a private blockchain where the nodes are limited to the land registries?
So one of the things that we're trying to do is create options for entry, because every government is not going to trust the technology 100%, and some governments will trust the technology. So we want to create the potential for private real estate registries, which would basically function as a real estate company. But then there would also be the public registry, which would function as the effective registry that has all of the data encrypted attached to it, but is publicly accessible. And if you are the owner of a piece of property, you'd be able to access all the encrypted data as well as the government official, but all of the data would be in one place. So again, when we're talking about a public registry, everything does not need to be accessible in a public registry, because there is some sensitive data attached to each property, whether it's a social security number or a person's date of birth who owns the property, or something that is could potentially be used to steal that person's identity later. So again, if you're talking about a public registry, we're looking to do public registries, but everything on that registry would not be unencrypted necessarily, because again, there is going to be something sensitive that is going to be public that everyone doesn't need to know necessarily.
The next one.
Could you please elaborate on your process to solve a conflict? So in case who's deciding if there maybe is a false entry in the blockchain, who's deciding to override this entry? Who has a final word? I guess that's one of the vital points.
So what ends up happening is we can only take the words of the people and the government official document. So if the chief says that a certain transaction happened, we can only take his word for it. And as long as it lines up with the government document, that's all we can do. We can't go in and say, oh, we have history and we have video and we have proof, because that's what their courts are for. So the issue becomes, as a third-party registry, all we can do is take hard data and then the official words. And then again, if someone's a landowner and they have their record or title, we can take that landowner's title and their word that they own it. But if their brother or sister comes and says, oh, they sold it, we can't do anything with that because they're not an official.
But nevertheless, coming back to this question, which is a very valid one, in these countries, I've been once working at the World Bank, and for that reason I know this chief system to a certain degree and know the complications. I mean, once you get into a struggle of who is really owning this, of course you have to ask someone. And in the end of the day, is there any judge system in these? Have you already been confronted with the judicial system of one of those countries?
Well, our CEO has a lot of experience arbitrating these types of conflicts. And in Ghana especially, one of the main issues is that a lot of times the chief will take the property, like say there's a widow who owns a piece of property. A chief will take that and give it to his brother or just a man. So the issue of the chief's judicial system being unfair is a real issue, and this is where what we're trying to do is understanding that we're not dealing with a fair chief system. We're trying to, again, with the Trojan horse, go to the people to say, if you guys start working with this, you can start registering your properties, and then the government will be your protectorate on this title against the chief coming in and stealing it. So then we're trying to turn around and rebuild the bridge with the government by saying, we know the chiefs are unfair, and we know that you have this problem, but if you just do this one thing, then you could potentially have a solution where your government will come and protect you from the chief in this one situation that's a really bad one.
Michael.
Thanks. Michael Schillig, King's College London. Thanks for a very interesting talk. What's not entirely clear to me is how blockchain comes into this. I guess it relates to the questions that we had earlier. So what makes your system different from simply a database, maybe a shared database, where certain people have access to, like the government and the chief? So where does the blockchain come in?
There's not much difference between blockchain and SQL. Let's get that clear. Like databases, there's very little difference between a database and a blockchain. The main difference is that the data is not stored in one place and that it's immutable. That's basically it. So again, it's like you can't burn the blockchain, you can't bomb the blockchain, you can't set it on fire in one building to destroy it. And that's the case with a lot of these paper records. If you go and burn a document that's the land title, all of a sudden your protection's gone, so then that person has no proof that they're the true owner of the title. Well, if that title is distributed around the world and it can never actually be destroyed, then that is a huge difference between a paper registry and even a digital registry that can be modified, because if there's a government official that can go into a record and change it by him or herself, that creates a scenario in which one person as a nefarious agent can affect many people, and the blockchain doesn't 100% prevent that, but it creates a more transparent ledger, which makes it a much more difficult scenario for one nefarious actor to change the records. They would have to basically convince everyone who holds the records on that blockchain to modify their data, which is a Sybil attack or a 51% attack if it was on the hard data itself. It could be done, but it would take a lot of effort to convince people to change their records on the blockchain, or fork their records on the blockchain.
Before we come to the next question, can I add another question? But you are in a moment. Who's approaching you? Are you advertising that you have a nice product and it would be good for you to have it? Or are you already in the stage that people from the government actually are approaching you? Because after all, I mean, the prospect of getting tax income from land must be extremely attractive, at least for a number of governments, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, one of the great things is early on, we learned that we needed to change our rhetoric, so we very much stopped talking about corrupt governments and started talking about the benefits of taxes. So what ends up happening was there were lots of requests from academics to study Bitland and try to see, because there was a lot of skepticism about the blockchain, and the academics were coming in saying, oh, what are you guys actually doing? What are you actually doing on the ground? So because the academics were interested in trying to debunk us, then they basically took our information to the governments, and because we were pragmatic about our rhetoric, then the governments are like, hey, you know, you're not the normal blockchain is gonna fix everything, blockchain's the savior type crowd, so that makes them more likely to send a request for proposal to us. So this is where what ends up happening is they'll usually set up a meeting and they'll have us present the project and say what we've done and what we could do to their state or country, and then they'll say, oh, we like it or we don't like it and we want to hear a proposal or not. And you know, one of the things that we're doing is we only go where we're invited, because that makes it a lot easier for the rhetoric to be accepted. So we're not forcing ourselves on any government or doing cold government calls or anything like that. So it makes it a lot easier when they're the ones contacting us.
Next question.
Of whether blockchain is actually necessary for this. Because of the distributed nature of a blockchain, do you see this as a big barrier to implementation? Because it's like a blockchain, some people say a blockchain is just, it's a very expensive database, right? Because you have to store everything in, the information is distributed, right? So do you see this as maybe in some regions which need this database, maybe this is not the priority which people have in these areas?
Well, okay, on that note, we actually chose BitShares over Bitcoin early on because BitShares is proof of stake. It's a hell of a lot cheaper than Bitcoin for transactions. And as well, there's not as much cost. There's not nearly as much cost associated with BitShares. So one of the issues becomes databases of this information need to be stored one way or another. And because the current paper systems are basically preventing foreign investment, and in the case of Ghana, they were not even legally allowed to transact in some cases because the registries are so outdated. Any sort of movement into a new database is going to bring an influx of new investment and new capital. So this is where it's not very difficult to convince a government that has no inflowing capital to try something new. And this is where, even though the Ghanaian government was a lot more corrupt, because they were basically broke and had no other choices, it was like blockchain or die. And this is where I think when you have a government that's really in one of those scenarios, it's like they can fight blockchain all they want, but they really have no choice to adopt it, or their government goes the way of the dodo. So.
Thanks, first of all, for traveling over. I'm Daniel. I'm practicing law in Munich, the beautiful city of Munich. Actually, first of all, an argument and an experience to underline the importance of what you're doing, because I think you can convince governments with a potential tax income, but you lose a lot of other stakeholders on that argument. But actually, my mom just traveled Ghana and returned, and they were about to donate to an orphan home, but there was a dispute over the land where this orphan home was built in, so they couldn't really offer them the funding. And I think that's potentially another use case. But actually, I was about to ask a question. If we talk about land registries, we talk about things which are more subject to time, right? They need durations of 50, 100 more years. And you described, first of all, the blockchain technology behind that, and also the dependency of the local utility and the local infrastructure. How can you make sure that this is proliferated over these very long time horizons?
So one of the intricacies of Ghanaian land registries or land ownership is that you can't actually own land. You can only have tenure for 50 or 99 years. So one of the things that we did was build in these tenure contracts into the title or into the registry. So it's like if someone has a title that's going to expire, it'll send them a notice saying your title is going to expire October 10th, 2019. So if that person wants to renew, then they have the chance and they have proper notice, but as well, they're getting a notice that their tenure is going to expire. And this is where, because of those intricacies, there does need to be a mechanism that makes people aware of the tenure that's left or how much tenure they could potentially purchase. So again, it's like, if we're listing a property in Ghana, it'll be 50-year tenure will be on the title or something. So there's no confusion about if you're purchasing something, if it's a 50-year tenure or 99. But again, this is where those nuances about the land titles make it necessary to make sure that someone's not purchasing a property thinking they own it forever when it's really only 50-year tenure. Does that answer the question?
Hold on, take the mic up.
Sorry, that was more about the blockchain itself, right? Because you need a blockchain into which will remain for decades or even centuries.
Well, right. I mean, it's more so how the blockchain can be compatible with that local regulatory infrastructure. Because again, even though the blockchain may be around for 100 years, their tenure is only for 50 years. So there has to be a mechanism in the blockchain that acknowledges that 50-year tenure and flags it or somehow exchanges it or pushes it back to the government or whoever. So again, that's where that specific nuance to the Ghanaian regulatory system necessitated that we build in this type of alert system to the contracts. So again, it's like the blockchain reflects the real world or what is happening in the real world, but it can't go into the real world, and that's where, again, you need to have some sort of regulatory body or access control point that is the connection to the blockchain.
Excellent. Do you have other questions? If that is not the case. Oh, we have over there, down here.
Sorry, me. Oh.
No, go ahead. Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a quick question because you mentioned proof of stake as your consensus algorithm, and I was wondering whether you could say a little bit more about that. So what's the stake and what is it based upon?
So proof of stake is a consensus algorithm that does not use hardware mining. It uses software mining to basically use your tokens as your proof of stake in the network. So someone who has 100,000 BitShares tokens has more stake in the BitShares network, so they'll earn more witnessing transactions than someone who only owns 100 BitShares tokens. So this transition makes it so that the computation power is not as electricity heavy or electricity intensive, but as well because it's dependent upon holding a number of tokens that can't be faked. It doesn't need to be as cryptography heavy to ensure the integrity of the stakeholders. Because one of the issues becomes people say, oh, the SHA-256 algorithm or the KEKAC or whatever is much more complex. Well, complexity doesn't always solve the problem. And there's the brace paradox where you can make a system too complex and then the complexity starts to cause problems. So we're trying to, we also saw that the electricity costs of proof of work systems were going to be very daunting. You know, when we implemented the project, Bitcoin transaction fees were maybe 30 cents, and then they jumped up to, you know, $6, $30, depending on the transaction. So BitShares transaction fees have stayed below a penny pretty much this entire time. And again, as far as proof of stake, it's still early on in the protocol's evolution, but there's delegated proof of stake being developed, and one of the issues becomes, does the entire network need to process everything? And this is one of the big issues with the Bitcoin network, or why they were trying to segregate the witnesses in the sense of everybody doesn't need to be processing everything all the time. And if you break it down so that people are only processing what they need to, it's cheaper, more efficient, and more effective. So this is where proof of stake as a system is not only more cost effective, but it disincentivizes that hardware mining special interest group.
Excellent. I think we are through, and that means we are even in time, which in the consequence means that we have a break. But before that, please give a big, big, big hand to the wonderful presentation.